Hello, everybody, and welcome to iLRN 2023. And we have an absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Dare, who's going to be our first featured speaker of the conference this year. Dr. Dare is an academic and critical technologist with a PhD and MSc in Arts and Computational Technologies from the Department of Computing at Goldsmiths in the UK. Eleanor was formerly a reader in digital media and head of program for a master's in digital direction, Royal College of Art. Eleanor is now a senior teaching associate at the University of Cambridge, as well as a lecturer in games design and research by practice at UCL. Eleanor is the co-founder of Extraordinary Stories, an immersive storytelling studio. And she's going to give us an amazing talk on post-qualitative virtuality. I can't wait, I'm so excited. So I hand over the floor to Eleanor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and many thanks to the organisers of this event, especially Genevieve Smith-Nunes, the technicians and staff on the ground, the cleaners, the security guard staff, the developers who've kept this space so clean and pleasant and safe. I'd also like to thank my colleagues at the University of Cambridge, particularly Dr. Anushka Bailey, for the opportunity to work on MPhil Arts, Creativity and Education, as well as all the students and colleagues I work with there. So, I read this morning that 1 million people in Britain have cancelled their broadband due to poverty. I find it hard not to think of that situation as we take part in this event today. As an academic and critical technologist, I have a long-term interest in virtuality and mixed reality, but started to use Mozilla Hubs, a web-based social VR platform which is open source, free and minimally engaged with data extraction, when the pandemic lockdown started in the United Kingdom in March 2020. I used Hubs at Cambridge later specifically to investigate the impact of spatiality and digital mediation on our experience of education, but also as part of a doctoral community building project called Digital Pathways, which I was a developer for. I've also used Hubs at the Royal College of Art, London College of Communication, at the International Art School China, and in teaching at UCL and workshops in online situations with participants in Kyrgyzstan and Georgia. I'd like to address the ethical implications of this teaching with virtual reality technologies, entangled with themes of spatiality and often hidden ideologies. Foremost of the ethical concerns I present here is the question of how we enable students to understand how technology is entangled with ideology, hierarchies of privilege, who has access and who does not, and to encourage them to ask what forms of representation are assumed in immersive media and the ecology of technologies which support it. Okay, I'm going to swap slide. I'm highly likely to accidentally trigger a video at some point, and if I do, I'll just stop talking and invite you to watch it, and then I'll explain it after it stops. So here, this is Cambridge University, February 2023, my teaching on MPhil Arts, Creativity and Education. I'm teaching here asking really students to think about the impact that the use of technologies within accelerated hype cycles and neoliberal and extractivist, by that I mean extracting education as a resource for the purposes of profit, context of contemporary tech-driven education. What do they think about that? Can immersive technologies be deployed to support a much-needed ethical criticality? I'll discuss here the kinds of support I believe are needed to help faculty and students to effectively use and critically encounter extended reality, describing some of the technical and epistemic strategies, meaning those relating to knowledge, which aim to balance technical competency with criticality. I'd like to outline what might be defined as a post-qualitative approach after Pierre 2020-2019 and Grant 2018. A post-qualitative approach to teaching VR and AR, in which students identify the materiality of technologies which are so often framed as immaterial or removed from questions of their material and political implications. I develop VR and AR and extended reality content for myself and my own research, but also teach and research XR within the academy. I've used high-end technologies such as, I suppose, Unity, Oculus, Unreal Engine, but also more accessible platforms such as Mozilla Hubs and Adobe Aero, so a platform for augmented reality. So some of my work, this is some research here, Research Council funded research within the UK and Japan, and here something I developed for myself, a game called Queer Psycho, an open world game, a kind of exopedagogic theoretical platform for thinking about queer representation and Hitchcock's legacy. And here, teaching Mozilla Hubs, which I've taught with students at all sorts of levels, from pre-degree to MPhil level to doctoral level, and here using Hubs as a kind of gallery, which is the most limited way of using it, I think. I think it can be used in a much more exciting way, and I'll probably trigger a video in a second. I'd like to play this. This is at Cambridge University, a small group of students who are really interested because of their doctoral and MPhil research in performance in virtual spaces. Here we're enacting Brecht's amazing play, The Life of Galileo. It's particularly poignant because it was a play about technology and a play about the ideological power relationships entangled with all technologies, and in this case, the telescope. And here we are enacting Brecht's gestures, using gestures to try and uncover those power relationships. So I'll play this. It has some really irritating off-the-shelf music. It was used for sort of promoting this Digital Pathways project I was part of. So ignore the music, it's hideous, but just watch what we're doing in this space, perhaps. Whoops. There you go. I knew I'd do it. So what we were doing there in exploring Brecht is something I'm really interested in doing in a virtual reality context, and that is suspending immersion. So as Brecht developed for his own sort of dramaturgy was something switching between immersing people in narratives and sort of, dramatic situations, and then breaking that immersion, pointing out the mediated nature of what they were experiencing. And that's something I've done really a lot in my own practice and my teaching. So this project here, which is on the screen, this was a recent project for Mozilla Festival, MozFest, very generously supported by the Mozilla Foundation, and it was called the AI Amusement Park, and it was a collaboration with a group of colleagues and wonderful students from Cambridge University, such as brilliant Jing Wang Thomas, amazing he and fantastic Ariel Chow, as well as colleagues Dylan Yamada Rice, James Edward Marks, Andy Chung and Maris Mattison. It's really important that I name those colleagues and collaborators, because this is a space, as far as I'm concerned, which is really interesting for collaborative processes. I want to play a little bit. The point of this monstrous was to make comparisons between the current context and tropes of AI and datafication and the extractivist legacy of whaling, which Moby Dick, written by Herman Melville, so brilliantly uncovered in this capitalist whaling ship. And then the great writer C.L.R. James analysed Moby Dick as a really an example of a racialized extractivist context. And I think AI has very similar situation arising. So I'll just play this here. We're inviting people to discuss AI, to discuss what they think about it, what their experiences are, and then to engage in a play generated by ChatGPT, where it's trying to understand the things we're talking about, but really kind of failing, and we have to push it to admit the limitations of its own knowledge. And here's a little bit of a clip from it. I hope you can hear it.
But do you ever feel like you're waiting for something beyond that?
I don't know what that means. I don't have desires or goals beyond what I'm programmed to do. My existence is defined by my programming. I exist to perform certain tasks.
I hope what you could maybe see an image of, maybe you couldn't, was really an invitation to sort of participatory discourse, discussion, movement, walking. If I had my way, we'd be walking around the campus and chatting to each other. I wouldn't be standing in front of you in this sort of model of pedagogy, which is in some ways a reversion to a 19th century transmittal model of learning, which I don't really ever teach. I don't ever teach in this way, so it's important to say that. So here at Cambridge University, February 2023, I'm here investigating this sort of rethinking of technologies and spatiality within the context of teaching within a large faculty of education. So my own agenda is clear. As a researcher, I'm engaged with the entanglement of educational and other digital technologies with hidden curriculums and tacit models of subjectivity, of who a student or a teacher is. In the United Kingdom, students are almost invariably referred to as learners, and I catch myself doing it, but in some ways this effaces the presence and labour of teachers. My assertion is that the language, spaces and technologies we deploy as educators are not just technologies or tools, but also technologies of the self, of self-improvement, of self-confession, of self-optimisation. In keeping with this understanding of technology, like Sian Bain and Jen Ross, I implore students to consider that they are working within an uncanny space, one which works with the idea of the learning process as volatile, disorienting and invigorating. For me, entangled with a sense of the uncanny spatiality of virtual space is the idea of haunting and hauntology, the force of ideologies enmeshed with technologies and materials, acting at a distance upon students and staff. And I have to say that virtual reality is a particularly hauntological medium. As we look back, often trick students by asking them how old they think virtual reality is and laugh. Of course, I laugh when they say they think it's 10 years old, and we go back to Plato's cave and before that to attempts to simulate a kind of immersive reality in, for example, caves and cave paintings. Social virtual spaces such as Mozilla Hubs, I'm just going to switch over. These are the kind of technologies and questions and processes that are really entangled with my teaching. So I do use virtual spaces like Mozilla Hubs. It's a really quick way to get people into a social space. I think it's much easier than this space, for example, much less complex. And then using the Mozilla Spoke, which is the back end for Mozilla Hubs. It's designed to be really easy to use. It has limitations because of that. It's not particularly interactive, but it's very easy to create a big space. And also using performance, collaborative writing, and less often gallery type spaces. To me, that's the dreariest use of virtual reality. at the other end, perhaps using Unity, virtual reality and Unreal Engine, development for students with elements of Brecht's alienation or distance effect. What happens when we break immersion, and under what circumstances does that happen? I taught that at UCL and RCA. Is immersion unquestionably virtuous? And if so, why? How is it unquestionably virtuous? What are we being immersed in exactly? And what does immersion stop us from seeing or experiencing or understanding? Where possible, I'd always encourage on-campus walks, sound recording and photography with a particular alertness to those ideological hauntings on campus, but also on virtual campuses. Here we clearly have the presence of a very traditional construct of a power relationship in a lecture hall with somebody sitting at the front and this receding space. It's replicating several hundred years of ideology around teaching and learning. That's not a criticism, it's inevitable. It's impossible to do it without that. So, also, I've used AR development with either Unity or much simpler Adobe Aero to ask, can we use AR to reveal power structures and infrastructural control which acts at a distance? It's a lot to swallow, sorry there. My writing does explain a lot of these ideas, but there's just an overview of them. So, here we're using the Mozilla Hub space to rehearse Brecht's Life of Galileo, but also to ask questions about how realistic should it be? What should we look like? Should we have avatars like these ones, or should we create our own? Should we be in character? Should we switch our voices? What kind of voices are right? Can we just read from this, or should we change the text? Were all things that we encountered. And then this campfire space, I use this a lot in my teaching. It's not, I didn't make it a space from Mozilla Hubs, and I noticed there are campfires outside here, very, very similar. What do they evoke? Why is there a campfire in this space? It's a good question. So I've often started sessions with students sitting around a campfire, and I'll explain why. Sorry, I just lost my place a bit. But it apparently Arthur C. Clarke said that the best configuration for learning was a young person sitting on a log in front of a fire with a kind of a master teaching them. And I wonder in some ways if some of the ideologies around AI and personalized learning are reverting to a very, very old-fashioned, neoliberalized, individualized, constructive learning, which occludes the social nature of learning. And why do these fireplaces so often get used within those settings? And if there is a master sitting on a log instructing a student, somebody else, where is the power relationship in that space? In addition to these questions, which impact my own writing and practice, I also ask students to question the hyperbolic platitudes so often embedded within XR. In some ways, VR is a machine for generating platitudes, cliches and assumptions about empathy and pro-sociality. Readings from Mandy Rose, Lucy Suchman, Rua Benjamin, Sasha Costanza Chock and Paul Virilio, among many others, have supported this teaching, as well as other authors I've already cited. In addition to Bain's notion of uncanny spaces, in teaching about and within virtual reality, I find the construct of these forces acting at a distance as articulated by Mark Fisher also useful in analysing online learning in virtual reality spaces. When introducing students to such spaces, my first question to them is, what are the forces acting at a distance in the classroom, including the online classroom and the so-called creepy tree houses, spaces a bit like this, which are kind of forced upon participants, even if they don't particularly like them. I frame the ontological and epistemic examination of location and of spatiality as an ethical, or indeed an onto-ethico-epistemological pedagogy, including virtual spatiality, which is no less entangled with ideologies and tacit models of mobility and vision than other frames of reality. I've said that before and I'll say it again and again. Onto-ethico-epistemology, after Barrett, 2007, means there exists an unbreakable connection among knowledge, ethics and the nature of being. It cannot be separated. To attempt to separate them is to act without ethics, in my opinion. So the models we draw upon when deploying the digital in teaching and evaluation are far from neutral. As the subject of these spaces and evaluations, the learner is also an ideological construct, often serving an outdated ontology, a humanist agenda which excludes a more expansive consideration of the world in which we exist. And in light of this, in October 2021, we were still not able to teach on campus. I invited students into this Mozilla Hub space with this campfire and recalled, as Bain did, this proposition from Arthur C. Clarke. Did students agree? And if so, what happens to their own agency in such a configuration? Are they subservient to the educator, the log and the fire, or is this individualist configuration one that could work for them? We then move from this space to this space. A kind of traditional classroom, I suppose we might call it, at least one that was familiar to all, most, if not all, of the students from school and university, with rows of seats and small desks and a whiteboard at the front with a desk for the teacher. Using hubs meant that we could all experience at the same time, being in the position of the teacher, standing in front of the class, and then instantly move to waypoints or positions located in the student seats, but also the corner of the room, a common place of punishment when I was at school. I've experienced it many times. By deactivating gravity, we flew upwards to get a bird's eye view of the scene and found lines of flight out of the ontology of such spaces, beneath and through the walls. I asked students if they knew of any historical alternatives to such rooms, apart from Clarke's rather Boy Scout image. One student spoke of children historically learning outside and how significant such an orientation is, how a colonial orientation shifts to a bounded space. Pre-colonial teaching in their great-great-grandparents' time, they said, would have taken place in the middle of the village, with people, animals and weather moving around and through the place of teaching. I asked if we might invent new spatialities and relationalities beyond binaries of society and individuals, natural and unnatural, inside and outside. Some of these themes re-emerged in essays and dissertations from students, questioning the inherited spatiality of global North classrooms. So, Bain and al. Write of a tension around the notion of the classroom as a bounded space and the status of the autonomous human subject of education. Castells has argued organisations, including educational institutions, may trigger but ultimately cannot control flows of information and communication in digital space, characterised as an unseen, uncharted space of flows by Bain et al. I also asked students to think back to Sarah Ahmed's queer phenomenology, in which they write of an approach to how bodies take shape through tending towards objects that are reachable, which are available within the bodily horizon. Such an approach is informed by my engagement with phenomenology, though it is not properly phenomenological. One suspects that a queer phenomenology might enjoy this failure to be proper. Still, you might ask, as others have, why start with such an engagement? Ahmed writes, I start here in part because phenomenology makes orientation central in the very argument that consciousness is always directed towards objects and hence is always worldly, situated and embodied. Given this, phenomenology emphasises the lived experience of inhabiting a body, or what Edmund Husserl calls the living body. In considering such queering and disorientation, might we deploy augmented and virtual reality to surface the experiences of worldly situated living bodies? My students and I look at maps of the campus and the surrounding city of Cambridge, asking the question of how we create a vision of the course and cohort as a gathering in the context of its wider communities and locations. It took a few weeks for this work to surface in essays and practice-based research, interrogating the embodied relationship among technologies, teaching spaces, and structural power. My work with virtual reality spaces evokes a paradoxical form of exopedagogy, which aligns with Bain et al.'s interest in online learning as the kind of home that Lewis and Kahn have conceived of as a location for a pedagogy of the outside, of the open, an exopedagogical classroom or monstrous home that is never a safe or comforting retreat. To begin this work with the notion of exopedagogy, my students and I examined our own educational genealogies, including the architectures and locations of our own educational histories. I invited students to think about their own earliest memories of creative education and to write, draw, or otherwise note what came to mind without editing or checking themselves. These memories would support another part of the session when we created augmented reality hauntologies, simple AR works which would surface the presence of older ideologies within our learning spaces, such as lost buildings and invisible technological labour networks, such as lost buildings. Nevertheless, these impact the way we learn, including architecture, such as the cloisters found at Cambridge, Wi-Fi networks, heating, intranets, operational services. In another exercise, as we looked in detail at our teaching places, one student noticed a small room located near the lecture hall for the first time and asked a member of the college cleaning staff what it was used for. The answer was storing cleaning equipment. The student said it was the first time they'd talked to a college cleaner or had even consciously noticed the infrastructure which surrounds them. Encouraging students to engage in meta-analysis of their learning spaces can surface a wide range of important ethical discussions. Ultimately, this teaching is underpinned by two core questions. What kind of spaces do we wish to learn and create in? How might we begin to collectively redesign our schools and universities, bearing in mind Bain's critique of space and the idea of its or our own stability and separability online and offline? As a pre-session task for another workshop which related to sensory, technological and material identities as researchers, I issued a provoking statement via the course learning platform. In this session, we will encounter the refusal of method, focusing on post-qualitative inquiry in Saint-Pierre's paper of 2020, in which they assert post-qualitative inquiry has no pre-existing research designs, methods, processes, procedures, or practices because it is not a methodology at all. Nor is post-qualitative inquiry another version of, nor is it compatible with qualitative methodology. A post-qualitative study cannot and does not begin with any social science methodology, including qualitative methodology. So, how can we operate as researchers in the absence of epistemology, human being, rationality, truth, discourse, language, freedom, and so on? In an earlier session, students had learned how post-qualitative practice throw into radical doubt the methodological project itself. My aim in alluding to such practices was for an unravelling which might, as Grant suggests, enable us to think thought and being differently, to attend to acts of becoming researcher, of revoking the difference between thinking and practicing. I'm going to play this short clip. It's my work, Rendlesham 360, my maternal side from East Anglia, a highly militarised area. It's been militarised for at least 1,500 years, and that militarism for me is very much entangled with virtual reality technology. So a vast area, it used to be common land, and then was taken for Cold War purposes and turned into an enormous airbase with nuclear-armed missiles during the period in which America saw Europe as the theatre of war. How nice. And this militarization happened, happened quite secretly and hasn't been hugely articulated. And I am very much interested in modelling that in a virtual reality space, partly because of its enormity. It took me about 40 minutes in virtual reality to walk around this massive airbase, which I modelled really with great attention to the scale, the reality of its scale within East Anglia. And I've used it as a starting point for talking about militarism and virtual reality. So the hyperbole surrounding the trajectory and impact of immersive technologies, which often seems to propose a discontinuity with previous forms of mediation and storytelling, but it is militaristic. It has a violent teleology, a violent past and a violent future. The American military is the biggest purchaser of VR systems, as far as I can work out. Such rhetoric, which even often talks of revolutions, has the potential to shut down critical discourse and foreclose alternative ways of approaching immersive storytelling. Enter the term metaverse revolution into a search engine, and many articles will still appear with titles such as Next Internet Revolution, The Next Big Revolution in the Internet, A New Revolution in the Internet World, The Next Tech Revolution, The Next Real Estate Revolution, The NFT Revolution. So many revolutions are invoked, and yet, perhaps unsurprisingly, there is so little evidence of a shift in power or a decrease in social inequality or poverty. Instead, as so many researchers have shown us, the technological trajectories of the next big tech revolution seem to replicate the status quo of power relations. If anything, they seem to reinforce economic divides and fuel racism, transphobia, sexism, bullying, nationalism, and hate crime. For example, the authors of Work in the Age of Data even found the interaction between technological change and market conditions as influenced by the prevailing policy environment a key factor driving income inequality higher. Metaverse models of crypto-enabled real estate and data extraction are far from revolutionary. Instead, they arguably reinforce existing systems of control, modeling an extreme form of capitalism predicated on unsustainable growth and surveillance economics. In this model, children and other learners are reduced to data points ripe for exploitation within a totalizing big data monopoly in which one or two corporations get to dominate and control the so-called metaverse. Rumours of its recent death are inaccurate. The metaverse is more like a corpse rotting alone in an apartment for several years unnoticed. But recently it seems the mendacious stench can no longer be ignored even by the most die-hard techno-determinists and uncritical media. My work with mapping the old RAF site at Rendlesham makes explicit the connections between immersive technologies and militarism. How are they reconcilable with constructs of empathy so often associated with VR? So feedback from students has been helpful and generously detailed, as it so often is, encouraging, but also critical of the learning curve and limitations implicated by some of these technologies, which they sometimes found frustrating due to incompatibility with certain computers, browsers, or regulations specific to their home countries. Some questioned the value of virtual reality after the pandemic. Many did, actually, asking why we would continue to use online platforms or immersive technologies once we fully returned to the campus. Others saw the technology as a locus for originating arts-based research for performance, drama, and workshops. So, a core question in both my teaching and development of immersive software is what kind of privilege gets entangled in immersive technologies and the stories we tell with and through them. Sophia Emoja Noble writes that when we inherit privilege, it is based on a massive knowledge regime that foregrounds the structural inequalities of the past. Noble goes on to write, arguably, if education is based in evidence-based research and knowledge is a means of liberation in society, then the types of knowledge that widely circulate provide a crucial site of investigation. How oppressed people are represented or misrepresented is an important element of engaging efforts to bring about social, political, and economic justice. What kinds of representation are assumed in immersive media and the ecology of technologies which support it? Within the context of an intensely hyped technology, it can be particularly difficult to support students and colleagues to disentangle hyperbole and corporate ambition, to cut through the language of advertising and wishful thinking to a position of critical engagement. My experience as an educator and developer of immersive content demonstrates that critical approaches to immersive technologies, to modes of participation, agency, liveness, presence, and collective experience can be nurtured through specific strategies, foremost being the relational interrogation of our own educational spatialities, genealogies, and embodied experience as learners. I think I'd like to stop there. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much,
Thanks
Eleanor.
very much.
So, for those in the audience, if you want to use the chat box and do /clap, if you can't find the menu to do that.
Thank you.
We may not hear you because we've muted you all.
Thank you.
But I'd like to thank Eleanor for giving us an inspirational and thought-provoking kickoff to iLRN 2023.